Welcome to Defcon 3. I'm KT McFarland. As we head into a new year, what are the top global threats the U.S. needs to watch for in 2016? Joining me with his take is Daniel Twining. He's Senior Fellow for the German Marshall Fund. He's coming to us via Skype from the country of Georgia. So, Dan, thanks for joining us. What do you think? Give me your top five. What crises and flashpoints do we have to watch out for?
KT, thanks for having me. The top five really obviously have to start with Middle East and the conflagration there. As the Syrian civil war spreads unchecked, spills over not into huge tensions between our allies and countries like Iran, but also the refugee crisis into Europe. So I would say there's a basket around the crises in the Middle East that are really significantly damaging to American interests. There's a set of issues around China. Chinese senior officials started the new year by declaring that the era of American leadership and very helpful contributions to the world is essentially over, and that we should get out of the way so that China can help to build a new order that sidelines us to a certain extent. That's a pretty significant great power challenge that we're looking at in the near term as well as down the road. There's a set of issues about the health of our friends, and I mentioned the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, but Europe itself is a mess with populist politics, the refugee disaster that's flooding onto the shores there, lack of economic growth, huge rates of unemployment. So I think America is less strong to the extent that our friends are weaker. There's a set of issues, I think, around the global economy, certainly. There's some good news, which is that America is growing, not as well as we would like, but doing a little better than most of the other countries. The people at home feeling very insecure and buffeted by these big trends, including possibly a hard economic landing in China, including slowing growth all over the place, the collapse of the oil price, collapse of commodity prices. And then finally, there's just a set of issues, I think, around the fact of American leadership and maybe its absence more than its presence, which is that when we stay home and don't get out there and help our friends in the world and deter our adversaries, things don't get better, they get worse. And so there's some real blowback at home, I think, as a result of a more insular and isolationist foreign policy that we've seen here in the last few years.
Let me go back to your first point where you said that the sort of basket of the Syrian problems, where it spills over to the refugee crisis, it spills over to the greater Middle East. One thing you didn't mention, though, was Iran and Iran's nuclear program. Do you think we're seeing the beginning of a nuclearization of the Middle East with Iran and its nuclear program, potentially the Saudis or other countries in the region deciding they as well need nuclear weapons?
I'm afraid we are, and I think this is what's perverse about President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, which is that I fear we will look back and see this as something that really enabled that trend rather than stopped it. Now, our friends who are diplomats, of course, would say you got to try diplomacy, you don't bomb, and they're right. It's not a very good deal, though, and of course the deal has so rendered our friends and allies like the Saudis insecure that they themselves are considering all of their options, as are our friends in Egypt and Turkey and elsewhere. And so the Iran, I mean, it's hard to separate all the crises in the Middle East because, of course, the Iranians are also very involved in fanning the flames of the Syrian civil war. The Iranians are great supporters of the Assad regime, or what's left of it. You have Hezbollah, a kind of a fighting army there, fighting the Syrian rebels in support of the Assad regime that has perpetrated such crimes against humanity and created this epic humanitarian crisis, really the worst since World War II. So Iran is implicated not just on the proliferation front, which is so dangerous, but also in this kind of near-term conflagration around Syria and, of course, in Iraq.
Talk to me about, you mentioned the refugee crisis in Europe and our friends in Europe struggling economically and now with this additional security threat. What happens to the European Union? Does it hold together? What happens to Germany? Can Germany weather this very large influx of refugees who then have a security issue all their own? Or what happens really to the terrorist threat throughout Europe?
And the good news is that we coordinate very closely with our European allies on terrorism. And of course, it's funny because about a year ago now, there was a big backlash in Europe around U.S. surveillance technologies and techniques, including allegedly listening in on the phone calls of European leaders and this sort of thing. But of course, what we don't say in the news every day is that these are our closest allies in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of really working together to wrap up a lot of bad guys, not just in the Middle East, but bad guys who are operating in our societies at home. Now, the Germans are, I think Angela Merkel thinks she's atoning for history by this very open policy towards refugees and migrants into Germany. But of course, the risk again is that this is too much openness. The open border policy fuels this backlash that you're now seeing not just in Germany, but in Poland and Hungary and the Balkans and elsewhere. It's really tearing the EU apart. If the EU were growing vigorously, if it was competitive and dynamic an economy as the United States, I think there'd be a lot less pressure. But of course, these are still somewhat statist economies, still big welfare states that are not as healthy as they should be, less competitive, less vigorous, less free market oriented. And so if I were a European leader, the thing I would try to do, in addition to coordinating more closely with the U.S. on the terrorism challenge, is really trying to reinvigorate economic growth and create opportunity societies in these countries. And that really, if you're going to integrate a bunch of refugees, you need to create a lot of jobs and a lot of economic opportunity there, including for your own citizens.
Well, Daniel, you have just taken us on a very grim tour of the world. So people watching must continue to tune in to Fox News if they want to learn more about this developing story. So thanks so much, Daniel Twining of the German Marshall Fund. And that's it for me, KT McFarland. Thanks for watching DEFCON 3.